Okay, so welcome to the research seminar today. Our speaker today is Rhiannon Neilsen, who has been here for this year and will be coming here next. Will be here next year as well, on one of the cyber postdocs. And originally from Australian National University. I think you're our first visitor from Canberra here. And here to talk about the responsibility to deceive, whether or not there's an affirmative responsibility to lie and cheat and steal in this business. So, in any case, so take it away, Rhiannon.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Herb, for the kind introduction. And thank you so much to everyone for choosing to spend your Tuesday afternoon with me talking about everything about lying, cheating, and stealing. I will be talking about the responsibility to deceive, deploying online disinformation and fake news for atrocity prevention. And if the title doesn't give it away, this is definitely the more dicey part of my research. So I'm really looking forward to hopefully a lively Q&A session where we can try and tease through some of these sticky issues. As most of us are aware, there's been a huge amount of scholarly attention and public discourse afforded to the proliferation of things like fake news and online disinformation. And these kinds of processes have been largely linked to increased rates of polarization, hysteria, uncertainty, discord, division, and in some instances, even violence. But what hasn't received that much philosophical attention, at least to my knowledge, is whether it might be permissible or indeed even morally required to disseminate online disinformation in order to prevent egregious human rights violations. And that's what I want to focus on today. So because we'll be spending about 30 minutes or so with me talking, I figured it would be best just to give a bit of an outline. So I'll start with a background as to where this particular project fits within my broader research. I'll set out the research question for today, the two different types of cyber deception that I think could be deployed for the responsibility to deceive, caveats, which are really important just to help scope the project so that we're all on the same page. And I'll set out the typology of what I'm calling atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns. So that's the first half of the talk. The second half of the talk will delve into the ethics. So I'll set out the case for using the atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns, the case against, some particular replies to the arguments against using these campaigns, addressing the elephant in the room as to whose responsibility it is precisely to launch these capabilities, before then concluding with my own thoughts as to where I am right now on the project. So just to give a bit of a background and context, this paper forms part of my broader research on what I call cyber humanitarian interventions. Cyber humanitarian interventions is the sophisticated use of cyberspace operations that intend to disrupt perpetrators' means and motivations for atrocity crimes, specifically genocides, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansings. By disrupting perpetrators' means for atrocities, I'm referring to cyber operations that hack into perpetrators' networks, that disrupt their communication lines, their financial transactions, weapons shipments, transport, GPS location devices, and so on. Essentially, anything that the perpetrators actually need to go through with their crimes. By motivation, I'm referring to measures that try to convince the potential perpetrators not to participate. And for those who are familiar, typically within the literature, there seems to be an overwhelming focus on things like deprioritizing toxic content on social media feeds so that it doesn't occur as high up, debunking or disputing conspiracy theories. That's when you see on your social media feeds, it says flagged, this claim has been disputed. This is something that a lot of us saw during the COVID-19 pandemic. Deleting online hate speech, and of course, deplatforming repeat offenders. Donald Trump probably being the most famous example of that. And obviously, I think there are a lot of good reasons as to why these kinds of capabilities should continue, and there's really excellent research in that space. But one of the things that I worry about is just deleting the online hate speech or deplatforming those who post the content doesn't actually engage with the human beings who hold these views. And if anything, I think it risks pushing them further to the fringes and left to fester, that is, to further radicalize. I also think this focuses kind of a way in which the big tech corporations have deleted the online hate speech, so it's no longer on their platforms and therefore no longer their problem, which is in itself problematic. So in addition to these measures, I argue for actually reaching out and what they call in the industry touching the users, engaging with those particular users. And there's two ways in which I envisage that operating. The first is via what I call targeted educational campaigns. Targeted educational campaigns are tailor-made, facts-based advertisements that appear on individual social media feeds that advocate things like respect for human rights, toleration, and restraint. And crucially, these targeted educational campaigns are intended to be designed based on individuals' big data, things like their likes, their searches, their posts, their locations, and so on. And in that way, it's the same kind of logic that we get tailor-made targeted advertisements based on a concept in our area for a group that we might like, or maybe like a New Yorker subscription magazine. So the goal here then is to have the targeted educational campaigns resonate with those particular individuals. So I want to think of this as kind of like leaflet dropping in war, but with the crucial difference of the scale, speed, targeting, and most importantly, the personalization of those messages. The second is what happens when appeals to those individuals based on information and facts fail, as they so often do. Now, obviously, I think these targeted educational campaigns need to be pursued first and alongside any other kind of campaigns. But I'm wondering whether it might be ethically permissible or required to target potential perpetrators with atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns in order to achieve the same outcome, that is, to refrain from violence. So that brings us to what I'm focusing on today. Does the responsibility to protect populations from atrocities trump our responsibility not to deceive? Or more concretely, might there be a responsibility to deceive via online disinformation in order to fulfill responsibilities to protect? There's actually two different ways that I can sort of conceptualize this operationalizing. The first on the left-hand side is what I call direct cyber deception or cyber manipulation. And that's perhaps most appropriately captured under the broader category of cyber espionage. So it involves hacking into the perpetrators' networks and stealing the information resident in their systems. But it also involves planting fabricated information, manipulating supply chains so that perpetrators don't actually get the ammunition that they need, or the concentration blueprint so that they can't actually go ahead and build such institutions, falsifying orders from higher up, and so on. I'm not really going to be focusing on this too much today. That's why it's sort of blacked out. I do have a paper coming out in international ethics and international affairs on this. So if people are interested and want to talk about it more in the Q&A, I'm very happy to. But what I want to be focusing on more is what I've called atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns. And I define these kinds of campaigns as those that target certain individuals based on their big data with tailor-made fake news that appear on your social media feeds, again, in the same way that targeted advertisements do. The key distinction here, however, is that, again, contrasted with most other forms of disinformation, usually as we think of it, these kinds of campaigns attempt to convince potential perpetrators not to advocate for, condone, or participate in those atrocities. Okay, so before I lose the room entirely, because I realize this is a bit of a dicey argument, and before I explain how I can actually see these disinformation campaigns operationalizing, there's a few caveats that I think are really important for me to set out. The first is that I'm only considering these disinformation campaigns in the context of preventing mass atrocity crimes, specifically genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansings. Other scenarios could plausibly qualify for the use of these kinds of campaigns of deceit. So we might think of supporting rebel groups, resisting unjust regimes, for instance, but these fall beyond the scope of what I'm focusing on today. Second, ideally, individuals would be convinced not to participate in atrocity crimes by appealing to the immorality of their actions with notions like human rights and human dignity. And that's why I advocate first and foremost with the targeted educational campaigns that I set out earlier. But it's precisely when these peaceful efforts fail or prove unsuccessful that we're confronted with the question of whether it might be plausible to resort to campaigns of deceit. And this is especially the case before putting boots on the ground via armed humanitarian interventions. That said, these peaceful measures to protect need to continue throughout the duration of the operation. And that's because I think potential perpetrators must be consistently reminded of the purported wrongfulness of their actions. And again, this is something that I think the targeted educational campaigns can achieve. Fourth, and as you'll see in the next slide, under no circumstances am I saying these disinformation campaigns involve or thereby contribute to things like hate speech, defamation, bigotry, discrimination, and so on. I think there is a case in which we could use things like malinformation. So that's the use of truthful information intended to cause reputational damage, or even things like spin. But today what I'll be focusing on is the intentional spreading of outright lies, so disinformation. Fifth, finally, and I think relatedly, these disinformation campaigns are only interested in influencing the perpetrators' beliefs about whether their participation in the atrocity is feasible or possible. So the aim of the game here is to just try and get the potential perpetrators to stay at home. I talk about this as rendering perpetrators epistemically worse off. Okay, so all of that being said, I've created a typology of 8 different types of mendacity that I think could appear on potential perpetrators' news feeds, again, in a way that is tailored with them and therefore resonates more precisely. I also think when we're talking about targeting potential perpetrators, I'm basing this on those who post things like hate speech or exhibit support for violence against a particular minority group, or even membership in the groups that would be expected to go through with the atrocities. So members of the military, for instance. And I'm thinking here about the example of the Tatmadaw, the Myanmar military who perpetrated the clearance operations in Rakhine State in 2017. Okay, so first example is futility. So this could be a targeted disinformation campaign that says something like, the operation is covered, we don't need your assistance today, you can stay at home. Second, diversion. So the road leading to this particular ethnic minority, the village where they're located has been flooded, or it's under extreme weather conditions, so we can't reach it today. The third is international attention. So there's been an increased rate of international condemnation and likelihood of protective action, so we're going to hold off until that seems to cool down. Fourth, punitive measures. So that's the potential perpetrators being targeted with content that says you will be prosecuted and punished at the International Criminal Court if you follow through with these crimes. Just very quickly, it may seem a bit strange to have that in the disinformation category, and the reason I've included it is just because the actual rates of rank and files being prosecuted at the International Criminal Court is so low that we may as well consider it a disinformation, a lie. Fifth, delay. So we're waiting for something to occur before we can commit the atrocities. And that could be something like we're waiting for certain weapons shipments to arrive, or international delegations to leave, or UN peacekeepers to leave the country or the area. Sixth is falter. So recent polls find that neighbors in your area are less inclined to support violence against a particular ethnic minority group. Again, this is all lies. Seventh, confusion. So breaking news, the minority group has moved to this location, and now this location, and now this location, essentially just to discombobulate the perpetrators as to where the victims actually are. And finally, distraction, where essentially the perpetrators are just targeted with other unrelated false news based on what that particular individual likes. So it could say you should definitely go do this thing down the road instead of going to the ethnic cleansing today. So hopefully, again, you'll see from this typology that in no way do these campaigns refer to the perpetrators themselves as being untrustworthy or involving defamation or hate speech. But if they are looking eerily familiar, it's because they do intentionally echo what we now understand to be voter suppression. So during the 2016 US election, in addition to the Get Out the Vote campaign, which intentionally tried to encourage potential Trump voters to go to the polls alongside what they called persuadables, people who they thought they could convince to vote for Trump, a lot of these disinformation campaigns also targeted Democrats with things like, don't worry about going out to vote, Hillary Clinton has this in the bag. And the aim of the game there was to, again, to try and get the voters to simply stay at home. So I'm talking about the same kind of logic, but in a atrocity prevention context. I didn't think that I would have to include this, but I thought it was important just to make it very clear. I think obviously it's wrong to interfere with or suppress an individual's right to exercise their democratic liberties, as with the 2016 US election. So I'm not condoning voter suppression or election interference in any way, although others, such as Cecile Farber, have made a qualified case for this precisely in the context of atrocity crimes. I think this precisely because people have a right to participate in the democratic process, but individuals have no such right to participate in genocide. And that's why I think this question comes up. Okay, so that's the first half done. I'm now going to get into the ethics. So in the paper, I outline arguments for and then against these atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns. And the time constraints mean that I'm not able to do a deep dive into every single one of these. So this is just intended to be a snapshot, but I'm happy to unpack any more of them in detail in the Q&A. So the argument could be first that the responsibility to deceive is simply a case of dirty hands and lesser evils. According to Michael Walzer, and I'm quoting here, we have to get our hands dirty by doing what we ought to do. So lying to perpetrators may be wrong, but it's less wrong than killing the perpetrators or allowing the genocide to go ahead. So in this case, we have the choice between either dirtying our hands via lying with the disinformation campaigns or bloodying them, either because we fail to protect, as the international community often does, and the genocide goes ahead, or we act via more forceful measures to protect, such as armed humanitarian interventions and putting boots on the ground, which is again also something what was considered required in certain circumstances when it comes to atrocity prevention. Second, the argument could be that the perpetrators forfeit their right not to be lied to about matters regarding the genocide. So it's not that the perpetrators have forfeited their right not to be lied to about everything all the time, always. Indeed, if anything, I think that they're still owed the information regarding the truth of the wrongfulness of their purported actions. And this is something that the targeted educational campaigns can achieve alongside the disinformation campaigns. For those who are interested in the room, this is kind of pulling at the tension between Immanuel Kant and Benjamin Constant, which is a conversation that was happening in the 1700s. Happy to talk about that a bit more as well if it's of interest. Third, in a similar vein to armed humanitarian interventions, the intended beneficiaries presumably consent to us lying on their behalf and for their benefit. And this is true even though they may be negatively caught up in the operations. Again, similarly to military interventions that involve often in bombing the intended beneficiaries. Fourth is uncomfortable duties. So obviously when we think about the responsibility to protect, we're thinking first and foremost about protecting the victims of those atrocities. But I think we might also have duties to the potential perpetrators to prevent them from doing something that would lead to international legal punishment, post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, or even moral injury. Moral injury being the extreme feelings of guilt and shame that arise when one has perpetrated a morally impermissible act. The logic here is that lying to the potential perpetrator does indeed wrong them if you don't subscribe to this second view. But it's not as wrong as allowing them to do something as egregious as mass systematic slaughter. So basically trying to prevent them from doing something that they may otherwise regret doing. And fifth and finally, I argue that we have duties to home populations of the intervening agents to use the least costly means possible if we're to realize these protection obligations. Obviously less costly to launch disinformation campaigns rather than mount some sort of widespread military intervention. Following that logic, I think we also have duties to the intervening soldiers who would presumably not want to risk life, limb, or kill others if the same end could be achieved via disinformation campaigns. And we have duties to future populations who would rather not grow up in the context of post-armed humanitarian interventions or worse, genocide. So that's sort of a snapshot of the different arguments that I have. And in the paper, I sort of play a game of chess with myself where I set out the case for, and then I set out the case against. So I have three main arguments against using these disinformation campaigns. The first is moral hazards, which is a concept that's borrowed from economics. So ideally, only potential perpetrators would be targeted with these disinformation campaigns. But for those of us who are all aware, it's often an unrealistic expectation to assume that the disinformation campaigns will be only contained to those perpetrators. Often these disinformation campaigns spill over and could affect victims as well. As a result of these false news campaigns, victims may not undertake their own protective action precisely because they believe it not to be necessary, or they might engage in misguided action based on that fake news. So an example of this is that the victim group may choose not to flee a particular area because they assume that the perpetrators are going to a different area. This is the sort of diversion logic within the typology that I discussed earlier. Or the victims might wrongly assume that the genocide is no longer going ahead because the neighbors don't support it. That's the sort of falter logic. And of course, you can see how that's a pretty perilous expectation to have. The second is ineffectiveness. So the disinformation campaigns might not might actually fail to convince the potential perpetrators to refrain from mass killing, because of course there's nothing stopping them just sort of scrolling past the disinformation campaigns on their newsfeed. But it might even have the potential to exacerbate the violence. And my thinking here is that conceivably, upon realizing that they've been duped, the perpetrators might be enraged at the injustice of being lied to, and thus fight with greater veracity and ferocity than before. Also, again, a lot of these disinformation campaigns are largely verifiable. So it could be that the regime just sends a scout out to the village to see if the road has actually been flooded. And if it hasn't, which it wouldn't because it was a lie, they could just go ahead with the atrocities. So in short, the disinformation campaigns may not be effective, and so there's just no point in pursuing them. Third and finally, is that these disinformation campaigns contribute to the degradation of truth and trust, especially in this sort of post-truth era that we ostensibly find ourselves in. And the sacrosanctity of trust is extremely important when we're talking about just societal function overall, post-reconciliation, and peace building. So in short, fighting fire with fire just creates more fire. I think there are some pretty powerful objections to the disinformation campaigns, but in the paper, I don't think that they're entirely insurmountable. So I'll respond to each of them in kind first. So first and foremost, I think despite a lot of the literature on echo chambers and filter bubbles, none of us exist exclusively online. And I think the intended beneficiaries are perhaps most aware of this and their real world surroundings, precisely because many of them have been subjected to decades of oppression and systematic justice. Again, I'm thinking of the Rohingya ethnic minorities in Myanmar. So I think it's a pretty big claim to say that these the victims themselves won't undertake their own protective measures when faced with extreme danger. This isn't to say that the disinformation campaigns aren't without risk, and I'm not saying that. I do understand that they're quite a risky prospect. But there's risks attendant with other protection mechanisms. So things like sanctions that risk punishing the population and not the regime, armed humanitarian interventions, airstrikes, drones, putting boots on the ground. These things are often considered a blunt tool for protection, but nevertheless important and morally required if we are to fulfill our protection obligations. So I think really what it comes down to is just the level of risk that we're willing to accept. What this particular moral hazards objection does highlight, though, is the requirement to curate the disinformation campaigns to target the potential perpetrators as precisely as possible, so that it doesn't actually spill over and affect the victims, bystanders, or even potential rescuers on the ground. Okay, next, ineffectiveness. So I think it's first and foremost important to say that I don't think that these disinformation campaigns alone are going to be entirely effective at halting the genocide. Instead, I think when we are talking about effectiveness in the disinformation campaigns, really what we're talking about is buying time. So we're buying time for victims to escape, for other protection mechanisms like sanctions to take effect, or for us to design more careful protection duties to ensure that interventions are effective. I also think that we can talk about these disinformation campaigns being effective if it prompts the perpetrator regime to think twice about whether this is a campaign they actually want to go ahead with. Genocides in particular are extremely resource intensive and require a huge amount of logistical coordination. So if these disinformation campaigns can just nudge the potential perpetrators not to want to go through with that or to rethink whether this is something they actually want to sink a lot of resources into, I think that would be a success. Third, I think they can be considered effective if it convinces those who aren't maybe diehard or true believers in the cause. If we can convince those who are sitting on the fence to abandon the pursuit of participating in the killing, that will result in less participation and therefore hopefully less deaths. The fourth is that at the very least, it will just sow confusion into the information ecosphere regarding when, where, how, if, and by whom the atrocity is actually meant to take place. And hopefully that would result in the perpetrators being paralyzed to act because they don't really know where they're meant to be going, at what point, or who's doing what. So again, just to reiterate, obviously the best case scenario would be that the disinformation campaigns avert the atrocity altogether. But I think more realistically, atrocity suppressing disinformation campaigns can be considered effective if it's stymieing slaughter for now. That's the buying time logic. or it limits the participation and therefore the extent of killing in the atrocities. Now, I'm not so married to the idea of these disinformation campaigns that I think that they should go ahead despite everything. Obviously, if they're appearing to be wholly ineffective because they'll be counterproductive or they're unnecessarily time-consuming, or it would be too costly relative to other protection mechanisms, then I think that we just shouldn't use them. I think a lot of these protection mechanisms are weighed against each other, and if this is something that is coming out as not that effective, then we just shouldn't use them. But of course, that doesn't exempt moral agents from actually realizing their protection obligations. I think all it does is really prompt them to channel energies into other protection duties, and that could include military interventions. Okay, last one, replying to the erosion of truth and trust. So to be clear, I think this is probably the most compelling objection to what I'm proposing. But I think there are two considerations that put this particular risk into perspective. The first is that trust in environments where genocide is imminent or underway already has a substantially damaged level of trust, even to the extent of it being destroyed. So it's not that these disinformation campaigns take an environment from trusting and peaceful to untrusting and dangerous. And I don't even mean that in terms of the trust simply between the perpetrators and the victims. I mean it within the society overall. So testimonies from former Khmer Rouge perpetrators in Cambodia said that there was a huge amount of distrust even among the perpetrators themselves because they could be accused of being CIA agents and therefore subjected to genocide as well. So in these circumstances, as Cecilia Bock argues, the overwhelming justification is once again survival. Society is in a state of collapse, and a lie won't add to the chaos and the degradation. I think really what's going on here is maybe a deeper and more profound concern. And that is that the use of these disinformation campaigns in one state will necessarily precipitate an erosion of truth and trust beyond that state at risk of atrocities. So that is, waging the disinformation campaigns in state X will amount to distrust in states A, B, C, D, and so on. But I think this logic assumes that the erosion of trust in one state ipso facto equates to the erosion of trust in another, and I think that's wrong. I also wonder if this objection comes from the view that it's somehow more morally palpable or easier to justify bombing those over there for human protection measures rather than risking damage to truth and trust here in our own societies. So in some ways, even though it's more bloody, the armed humanitarian interventions is more contained over there, and we would rather that than risking truth and trust here. So to guard against the erosion of trust, I just want to reiterate that these disinformation campaigns are only to be waged within the sites at risk of atrocities and have to cease as soon as the threat subsides. So I know that's a lot, and let's say for argument's sake, we do think that there is a moral obligation to pursue these disinformation campaigns. The question that remains is who exactly has this responsibility? And this is my penultimate slide. So at risk of appearing state-centric, I argue that these measures need to be authorized and operationalized by states, either acting unilaterally or within a coalition. And my logic here is that this is because states are the principal bearers of duties to protect. I also don't believe that these measures will require UN Security Council authorization. So according to the Talon Manual, which is international laws applicable to cyberspace by a group of experts, quote, psychological operations such as dropping leaflets or making propaganda broadcasts are not prohibited, even if civilians are the intended audience. Now, obviously, it wouldn't make sense for these disinformation campaigns to appear on social media feeds as like sponsored by the US Department of Defense. Not only is that not going to be effective, we also need to retain a degree of anonymity. So I think it's critical that these disinformation campaigns emanate from sources that the perpetrators ostensibly trust in order to afford the greatest likelihood of believability. Or, as we saw in the 2016 elections, these disinformation campaigns could just appear from vague random groups or bots and then shared amongst the perpetrators themselves. And I think this, to an extent, would help. In addition to not requiring the UN Security Council authorization, I don't think that the UN should be involved at all. And I have two main reasons for this. The first is practical, and the second is ideal. So first, public deliberations at the UN General Assembly will likely undermine effectiveness. It'll alert the regimes that this is something that the international community is considering and therefore be prepared for it. The second is that the UN is intended to be the pillar of liberal institutionalism. It's meant to be the epitome of peaceful, diplomatic, transparent multilateralism. And I think it's of paramount importance that we preserve this institution. States, on the other hand, have long participated in propaganda campaigns, so I'm less worried about them. And finally, because these efforts rely on big data and need to appear on social media feeds, big tech corporations need to be involved. So I argue that they have due diligence obligations to monitor and report content online regarding risk of atrocities, not just to delete or deprioritize that kind of content, and to confirm that there is actually a risk of atrocities. And my intention here is to guard against the abuse by bad faith actors. So they would have to confirm that no, there isn't actually any Nazis in Eastern Ukraine, for instance. Okay, so all of that being said, this is where I land on the responsibility to deceive. I think ultimately, in the same way that scholars have long argued that military interventions are sometimes morally justified and required, even though we bear in mind their extreme long-term consequences, including the degradation of truth and trust and bloodshed, especially if they go badly. I argue that there is sometimes a responsibility to deceive via these disinformation campaigns. But I don't even think that the responsibility to deceive is a last resort. The last resort for human protection rightfully remains armed humanitarian interventions with their bullets, bombs, and body bags. That's it. Thank you.
Okay, so thanks very much for that. And in accordance with tradition here, fellows get the first crack at our speaker, and then we'll open it up. People online should enter their questions into the chat, and I will try to get to them as well. So with that, I had Luis, go ahead.
Thank you, Rhiannon, for sharing this very thought-provoking presentation. I have 3 quick questions for you. The first one, cases against. I'm thinking of 2 other cases against. The first one is an operational hazard. Is it on? It's okay. I have 3 main questions. The 2 first ones are about the cases against, and I can think of 2 other cases against. The first one is an operational hazard. What would happen after these operations are discovered? Especially, there is a lot of research among international organization scholars right now about how authoritarians learn best practices by participating together in multilateral negotiations and multilateral fora. And they can share how they reacted to this kind of operations, and that would decrease the level of effectiveness of these operations the second, third, fourth time that they are used. The second case against is a legitimacy hazard. What would be the effects when these operations are discovered on the sender, especially? What would happen to the legitimacy of the actor using this kind of operations? Especially if you think in the framework of R2P itself lost a lot of legitimacy after the Libyan case, especially because of how it was operationalized. So I think that these 2 hazards go hand in hand, the operationalization and the legitimacy hazard. And finally, the last question that I have for you is why unilateral operationalization, especially because you're framing this in the framework of R2P, and R2P explicitly says not to use it unilaterally. So maybe this is just a question of the framing, but if the framing is R2D as a complement to R2P, then why unilateral operationalization? But thanks a lot. This was, then again, very thought-provoking.
Should I reply?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Great, thank you so much, Louise. So I think the operationalizing hazard and legitimacy hazard, I do kind of touch on, but maybe I need to articulate it more clearly. I think when it comes to authoritarians learning about how to respond to these kinds of campaigns, which you're absolutely right, they do, because the disinformation campaigns are going to be different on a case-by-case basis, and it's difficult to sort of monitor the information ecosphere. Of course, in some dictatorships, they'll just turn off the internet altogether. This tends to be a bit of a penchant that autocrats will do. And if that's the case, if they are just going to turn off the internet, if they are just going to turn off social media feeds, then there's no point in us considering this. And by no stretch of the imagination am I saying that this is a silver bullet. I think either the cyber humanitarian interventions or the disinformation campaigns is a way of solving it all together. I think there's ways that autocrats can get around it, but it is just a tool in the atrocity prevention toolbox that we haven't really considered. And I think if we are able to deploy those mechanisms, and they'll be different on a case-by-case basis, dependent on the disinformation campaigns, I think it's something we should consider. When it comes to the legitimacy of the actors deploying the disinformation campaigns, this is exactly why I don't want the UN to be involved at all. States have long participated in things like propaganda, particularly in the global south. They've interfered in elections. They have conducted ruses, which of course is internationally legally permissible, as is disseminating propaganda. So the legitimacy of the agent itself, if we're talking about using subversive measures as a way of getting around atrocities, I think is something that may affect the reputation of a state, but the reputation of a state is also damaged if they don't go ahead and try to prevent the atrocity from happening. This is something that we talk about with the UN having blood on its hand in the aftermath of the Rwandan genocide in 1994. Your point about unilateralism, so as you'll know as well with R2P, the first pillar says that it is the state's responsibility to protect their populations. So when I'm talking about unilateral uses of disinformation campaigns, I'm thinking about where the perpetrators of things like ethnic cleansings or genocides, war crimes, are violent non-state actors. So first and foremost, it would be the responsibility of the state to try and prevent those violent non-state actors from killing their civilians. So it's referring to pillar 1 of R2P. But thank you.
Okay. Second question down here. Yeah. Identify yourself, please.
Hey, Ian Reynolds, pre-doc fellow here at CSAC and HAI. Thanks very much for this, as we said, very thought-provoking presentation. I have 2 questions. One is on another possible response, and the second on the tech sector. So the first one, have you considered the way in which once leaders of these genocides find out that something is up, that it could kind of work in terms of a mobilization effect? Like, okay, look, they're trying to tell you lies. I am kind of this perpetrator of truth. Believe me. So almost like in this vacuum of trust and deceit, they then become that loud voice that is able to kind of mobilize based on that. And then second, how do you foresee the tech sector responding to this, just as organizations in the United States, governments are kind of trying to regulate them on disinformation, misinformation? Like, no, don't do this, but also we want it as a platform for spreading disinformation. So just kind of wondering about that. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ian. Yeah, you're absolutely right. I think if the autocrats are able to then point to the fact that the disinformation is a way of mobilizing forces to participate in atrocities, that would be a really bad thing. I think this is also why throughout the presentation I was trying to reiterate that the targeted educational campaigns need to occur alongside that. And I think the disinformation campaigns are merely intended as like a stopgap. It's like we need to buy time for victims to escape or to ensure that other protection mechanisms are designed more carefully. But the perpetrators are consistently reminded that what they're doing is wrong. It's not only internationally illegal, but it's also morally impermissible. And I think even if autocrats can then point to, well, they lied to you about this, and therefore it will motivate people to participate in genocide, I'm hoping that the targeted educational campaigns will work as a way of trying to appeal to people not to participate anyway. Again, there are many protection efforts that don't work, and either because they just don't take hold or because it motivates people to want to participate in these atrocities with greater vigor. But I'm not sure if that means that we just shouldn't pursue them at all, because then the other option is we know that there's an atrocity mounting, we have to resort to lethal force, which includes killing not only the perpetrators, but unfortunately often the intended beneficiaries and bystanders and victims. And it has decades-long consequences, as Louise pointed to with Libya. Yeah, in terms of tech and regulating disinformation, you're totally right. This is maybe more of my sort of playful philosophical side of me that is just asking the broader question of like, what would we do in this particular case? I think in instances there would, if we do decide that this is something that we want to pursue, I think that we can make exceptions. So it's not always that we therefore allow the tech corporations to just have disinformation on their platforms, but they would have to work very closely with the international community where they approach them and they say, this is the exact disinformation campaign we want to launch. We want to launch it for this amount of time against these kinds of people. Is this something that you think is possible? And I would almost argue that the tech corporations have obligations to follow through with that, like a positive duty as opposed to just negative duties. But yeah, thank you so much.
Okay, we had a question from somebody right in back of Harold. I saw a hand go up there. Mask person, mask man. Okay.
Hi, thanks. Jim Goldgeier, visiting scholar here at CSAC. So super thought-provoking. And since you still seem a little squeamish about the idea, I was just curious. I mean, when we do this in wartime, it gets celebrated, right? Oh my gosh, we fooled the Germans. They thought we were going to go here. We landed here. Look at the Ukrainians. They fooled the Russians into thinking the offensive was here, and they went here. So we celebrate it in those instances. So why wouldn't we celebrate it in this instance?
Great. Thanks, Jim. I think it's because we know that lying is pro tanto impermissible, generally, right? We get really uncomfortable with it. But you're right, when we're talking about deploying campaigns against an objectively bad actor, and you can't really get more clear maybe than the examples of the Second World War with the Allies versus the Axis and Ukraine and Russia. I think we get uncomfortable about it because when we talk about disinformation, our minds go to the election interference in 2016. And often I don't think we're able to fully disassociate the ends for which they're being used and the actual concept itself. And I think a big part of it is because we worry about, rightly, the erosion of truth and trust all the time, everywhere, including in our societies. I think that's why we're maybe more comfortable for more harsh things to happen over there because it doesn't affect us. I also think that when we're thinking about the possible ways in which we can prevent atrocities, unfortunately, a lot of the time the international community is more comfortable with being paralyzed. Like we try to use the peaceful campaigns, they don't work. Sometimes we use armed humanitarian interventions, but often we just let the atrocity unfold. And that somehow seems, I'm not saying people are comfortable with that, but it seems as though we're more used to entertaining that idea rather than deploying disinformation campaigns and lying. I think it's an internal struggle that we have to sit with. Yeah, thank you.
Sergey?
Hi, Sergey Sanoch, Hoover Fellow. Well, continuing from the last question, I think we celebrate when it works, and we don't celebrate when it doesn't. And this is, so I have a couple thoughts on sort of the effects of this. The first concern I have, if the situation specifically when it's blamed on the targeted population, the people who experience genocide or threat of that, right? The thing I imagine is a real like you showed the cartoon in the end. Imagine it's a real person who is saying that these bombs or these leaflets, they're to save us. If this person is discovered, they are at risk, right? They could be blamed for that. So that's one issue. More generally speaking, I think, I understand that this might be effective in theory. The question is how in practice you can measure or estimate this, right? And this is, measuring information or disinformation campaigns is notoriously difficult. So you have one problem there, and then comparing it to the non-information options, to the military options, right? The military option would certainly have bigger, more tangible effects, whether they would be good or bad, probably even harder to estimate. So sort of in practice, how to sort of advocate for this campaign, how to make a decision, I think is a particularly difficult issue here. On the other hand, I wanted to sort of suggest one way to save you from one of the counter arguments, the one about general trust and reputation of states or any agents who are doing this, right? You mentioned that it's probably a bad idea to put Pentagon label on these leaflets. Well, I think in many parts of the world it would be blamed on Pentagon whether there is a label or there is none, and importantly, it would be blamed on Pentagon or State Department, let's say, whether it's disinformation or genuine factual information about, the consequences or international courts or whatever. So no matter what you do, the Pentagon and State Department would be blamed. This would be, in some context, I think, the argument that, if you will be blamed for that anyway, why don't do it, right? That's sort of one potential defense I think your theory could get.
Yeah, thanks, Sergey. I love the idea of just blatantly sticking the Pentagon and the State Department on these disinformation campaigns if it's going to have the same kind of effect. I think really my logic behind trying to make it emanate from sources that the perpetrators would ostensibly trust is because it's more likely to be effective, at least in the first instance. So one of the examples, it's a slightly different case, but in 2016, there was Operation Glowing Symphony, and that was something that the US Cyber Command, the Australian Signals Directorate, and GCHQ launched against the Islamic State. And in addition to hacking into the perpetrators' networks and deleting propaganda material and changing the password so that they couldn't get back into their accounts, they released fake versions of the Ramir and the Darbeek, which was the Islamic State's monthly newsletter, which is something they had. And in the newsletter, they said things like, oh, al-Baghdadi, our leader, has been martyred, and we're all very sad about it. Of course, he hadn't been martyred. And what they found, at least in the first instance, was this caused a degree of paralysis among the perpetrators because they were like, well, what do we do now? Our leader's been martyred. Who's in charge? What's meant to be going on? And then when they found out it was fake, it sowed even more discord and distrust and paranoia among the ranks. Because let's say both Herb and I are members of the Islamic State, and I share a copy of the Ramir, and then you find out that it's fake, he now doesn't trust me. It's like, Rhiannon, you're a CIA plant, you're an operative of the US. So I think even if there are ways in which we can manipulate or sow disinformation into these ecospheres from things that appear to be trustworthy, and then they find out it's not, I think that can still sort of, again, in the logic of buying time or frustrating the perpetrators' activities, is really helpful. So thank you.
Thank you, Rhiannon, for a great talk. Ori Rabinowitz, a fellow here. I wanted to kind of follow up on Jim's question. It sounds to me that to a great degree, you're continuing the proposition, which I agree with, that cyber operations should be conceived as a specific form of a covert operation. And I think that if, as long as we place the kind of intervention that you're mentioning under covert operations, then we kind of get rid of the entire bad sentiment about states feeling kind of queasy about lying and deceiving, because covert operations, regardless of what they're trying to achieve, and here they're trying to achieve something very noble, they're all about being illegal. Intelligence community operatives in general are legalized mafia. What they do outside their own countries, everything, every single aspect of it is illegal, whether they're trying to stop an atrocity or not. So my question is this to you is, first of all, do you know, or is there any kind of history of a covert operation that was targeted at stopping a genocide? We're not talking about general, regular military operations, or let's bomb the railway, let's send the platoon, right? We're talking about specifically covered operations. And the second question is, does this fit with the general gist of your argument? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Or. Yeah, so I think your point actually goes to, if I understand it correctly, more the first part of the direct cyber deception or cyber manipulation that I talked about. And that's the hacking into perpetrators' networks and planting fabricated information or sending false orders. In the lead up to and during the genocides in Serbia, Bosnia, the US actually hacked into Slobodan Milosevic's accounts, and they were able reportedly to do a lot more damage, but they didn't. They just sat and watched. And the reason, according to reports, that they didn't cause more damage internally in the way that you're talking about against this particular genocide leader is because the US in the mid-90s didn't want to show their hand. They didn't want to show that this was possible. In the lead up to the 2003 Iraq intervention, the US hacked into the Iraqis' secure networks and sent orders from that network to say, go home, pack up your things, leave the tanks neatly organized outside, and no one gets hurt. So there are instances within this kind of sphere where cyber has been used in these ways, but it's not something that we talk about strictly in the context of genocide prevention. And I think this is where my research really tries to marry the two. But there's more instances of that in terms of counterterrorism, the intervention in Iraq, and I guarantee that there's a lot going on in Ukraine at the moment as well. It's just not declassified.
Harold?
Great. Super interesting talk. Just 3 thoughts and reactions to some of the other comments that were made. The first, I think you could do more to focus on the voter suppression example, because that's sort of very concrete. And there's probably metrics out there on sort of what works and what doesn't work, which of those elements of the typology are more effective at getting people to stay home, which is really ultimately what you're trying to do. Secondly, I think in answer to Ian's question, I think the effect of being told that somebody else is lying to you is often to, as you just pointed out, sow confusion. What we've seen from some of the work on sort of foreign disinformation is like, you don't send one message, you send 8, 10, 20 messages.
Right.
So people are just totally paralyzed by confusion and they stay home. They don't use one of the 8 things in typology, use all of them.
Yeah.
All the time.
Yeah.
Third, I would say that this point about the intelligence agencies that Rebuttals just made is very useful, because that, I think, addresses some of these questions about permissibility, et cetera. Intelligence agencies engage in propaganda all the time. And I'll also say they do it without asking the tech companies necessarily for permission, because we all the time see tech companies publishing, oh, look, somebody was using our platform, we didn't know about it, and now we figured it out. So even that aspect, I think, we're relying on. Maybe could be set aside. People use the social media platform all the time. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, no. Cameron next, and then Paul. And then I'll get to the online in a minute, but we're approaching the lightning round. Go ahead.
Thanks, Harold.
No, wait, no, go.
Oh, am
go
I
ahead.
responsible?
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
great, cool. So thank you so much for that, Harold. I think I didn't include this. This is the Ramia stuff that I was talking about. I just didn't know if I would have time. This is some concrete examples of voter suppression 2012-2016. So this is wards within Milwaukee in Wisconsin. And in 2012, they had a huge amount of voter turnout, 75, 81, 83, 79%. 2016, they were targeted with a lot of disinformation regarding Hillary Clinton, and the voter turnout was considerably lower. Now, obviously, there's a huge amount of counterfactuals to this as to why potentially voters weren't as willing to support Hillary Clinton compared, of course, with Obama. But this is an example of where the voter turnout rates were different. So you're absolutely right. I think like within my broader work, I do try to touch on that, but I think there's a lot more to be unpacked about to what extent are these voter suppression tactics successful, and how can we glean that for the atrocity suppressing ones I'm talking about. The point about using all of them all the time, always, love that, definitely support that. And then third, not wanting the permission from the social media companies. You're absolutely right. They could just buy ad space. I feel uncomfortable with that for 2 reasons. One is that I just really don't want the tech companies to continue making money off something that they should be contributing to, which is the not allowing their platforms to be used for atrocity crimes. And the second is that I don't want somebody, if they are really good at their job, sitting at Facebook being like, oh, this is a disinformation campaign, delete. Like, because then that undermines the effectiveness of what the governments are trying to do. But I take your point, they potentially don't actually need their help. So thank you.
Okay, lightning round in person. That we got Cameron and Paul, and then I got to go to the two questions online, and then there's this question that I'll get to. But go ahead.
Since the 60s, the U.S. Supreme Court has regularly condoned police officers, law enforcement officers lying in the conduct of their investigations. So I wonder, while that's obviously a different case, domestic, purely domestic, does the logic you're articulating apply there? And I ask particularly because it seems like if one bought into that underlying legal ethical system that makes that permissible, then it would seem obvious within that legal ethical system that if doing so to prevent, say, neighborhood crime is permissible, then doing so to prevent genocide would obviously be so.
Pass it down to Paul, please.
Yeah, very brief question. Great talk. So you gave a very tight definition of situations in which this could be used, in your idea, but how do you prevent scope creep after it gets started?
Okay, so answer those 2, and then I'll go to online. So
Thank
1
you.
minute answer.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Cameron. I'm not familiar with the US Supreme case that you're referring to. My understanding, does that mean that they just wouldn't allow undercover cops? Because like undercover cops lie to people all the time in order for their investigation to take effect. So Oh, it is allowed. Oh, great. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Okay, I misunderstood. Yeah, oh, great. Yeah, obviously, I mean, yeah, maybe it's a bit of a cop-out that I just focus on atrocity crimes. I mean, that's kind of what my focus is on. This goes to your point as well, Paul. And then maybe it's a bit of a cop-out for me to just say I'm just focusing on some of the most egregious things that people do to one another. But there could be other cases where we see that this is something that has legal precedent or ethical arguments for. Maybe for my own benefit, I just focus on atrocity crimes.
Okay.
I'm not against it completely. And then in terms of guarding against the sort of scope creep and slippery slope arguments, I think this is a worry, and there is potential for these kinds of campaigns to be abused by bad faith actors. But I would say that we can claim pretty firmly that that would be an immoral use of the act. And even if it is a likelihood, I think that this is something that we just have to make sure we try to bolster against to the best extent possible. We say that armed humanitarian interventions is important for atrocity crimes. That was used and abused by Russia last year in terms of the invasion of Ukraine, but we all widely condemn it, and we've all rallied behind trying to ensure that that doesn't go unchecked.
Okay, and from online, Brett Paris asks about the moral hesitancy, is curious about the moral hesitancy of some to engage in deception against those planning genocide. If you've already embraced R2P, isn't R2D a natural complementary tool? And Donald King asks, what's your view on the relation between disinformation and military intervention? Should R2D and disinfo cease upon military engagement? And so on, those kinds of questions.
Right, thank you. Thanks so much, Brett. I think, so that definitely goes to what Jim was saying about why sometimes we feel comfortable about these disinformation campaigns in some instances, but we have this hesitancy now. Again, I do just wonder if it's because it's not usually how we conceptualize disinformation. I think for many reasons, we've automatically equated things like disinformation and misinformation as bad. And so we are trying to disentangle how we think about the ways in which it could be used for good, even though it's been used for good in many other instances offline previously. So my hope is that the R2D could be a complement to R2P, but again, we have to think more carefully about who's actually launching those campaigns. And Donald, your question about disinformation and the hesitancy again, I think this is something that we just need to spend a bit more time unpacking and thinking about. So I'll have to go back to the drawing board for that one.
Okay, and last question, Tron, get it out, and we can make our 2 o'clock deadline.
Tron, research scholar, CSEC, just a tiny little provocation here. Even if something is ethically sound from a utilitarian sort of consequence ethics perspective, if it is strategically unwise or even foolish, why would you want to go ahead with it? And I guess my question is, don't you agree that this information is a much, much larger problem than scattered war crimes? Provocation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Tron. So in regard to your first question, I don't think we should use it. Like if it seems as though strategically it's not going to be a useful tool in the toolbox, we throw it back in the toolbox and we find something else. Like I don't think we have to follow through the peaceful. Well, I think the peaceful stuff should always happen, and I think as the genocide is mounting, the targeted educational campaigns should be ramped up. But I think if the disinformation campaigns aren't going to be effective in the ways that I set out, we just should abandon it. I also think that your last point, at least the way that I understand it, is almost like weighing what we care more about, whether we care more about disinformation and the preservation of ensuring that no lies are in our information ecosphere, or the protection of populations from atrocity crimes. I guess my response to that is that I'm only talking about the disinformation campaigns in the immediacy of if a genocide is about to occur. And if we think these campaigns can protect those populations, I think we have a duty to do so. So maybe I just err more on the side of the second part rather than the preservation of the integrity of the information ecosphere. But thank you.
Okay, so that brings us to the end here. I'm reminded here of a conversation I had with a Pentagon officer who said that it's much easier to get permission to lie to a terrorist than to kill him. This sort of brings up all of that. This was great. Thank you to Rhiannon, and so bring it to a close. We're done. Thank you so much.